2 entire continents with no people on them at all. And then, at some point, people. It is the last great human expansion, and it is the only one where we can watch the science itself go badly wrong in public for most of a century. Because for about 60 years, there was a single accepted answer to when this happened. It was taught as settled fact. It was defended aggressively. Careers were damaged over it. And it was wrong. This episode is about how it fell apart and about why the best evidence for what actually happened is somewhere nobody can dig. Start with the thing that started it. In 1929, near a place called Clovis in New Mexico, and at a site nearby a couple of years earlier, excavators found stone spear points lying among the bones of animals that no longer exist. Not near them, in them, a point between the ribs of an extinct bison. That settled an argument that had been running for decades because it proved people were in North America while the Ice Age megafauna were still alive. And the points themselves are unmistakable. A Clovis point is a leaf-shaped blade with a long groove, called a flute, struck up the middle of each face from the base. That flute is difficult and risky to make. It is also completely diagnostic. If you find one, you know exactly what you are looking at. And they turn up everywhere, across most of North America, in enormous numbers. When radiocarbon dating arrived, the Clovis sites came back at around 13,000 years ago in a remarkably tight window of a few centuries. So the story assembled itself, and it was a very good story. People walk from Siberia into Alaska across the land bridge, which is dry because so much water is locked up in ice. Then they're stuck because 2 enormous ice sheets sit across Canada and block the way south. Then, around 13,000 years ago, the ice sheets pull apart and a corridor opens between them. People come down the corridor, spill out onto the plains, invent the fluted point, and sweep across 2 continents in a few hundred years, wiping out the mammoths as they go. It is tidy. It fits the dates. It has a mechanism, a doorway, and a moment. And it hardened into something more than a hypothesis. It became a rule about evidence. If Clovis was first, then any site claiming to be older than Clovis had to be wrong. So the standard of proof for a pre-Clovis site was set higher than for any other kind of archaeology. And here is where it turns into a trap. Because the evidence that Clovis was first was the absence of accepted older sites. And the reason there were no accepted older sites was that the model said they could not exist. That is a closed loop. It cannot be broken by evidence, because the evidence is judged by the model it is supposed to test. Archaeologists who worked on older sites found themselves fighting for their reputations. There's a nickname for the enforcers of this, and it is not affectionate. The Clovis police. Which brings us to a peat bog in southern Chile. In 1977, a local told a veterinary student about bones washing out of a creek bank. That eventually reached an archaeologist called Tom Dillahey. The site is called Monte Verde, and the peat had done something remarkable. Waterlogged, airless ground preserves organic material, and Monte Verde is one of the best preserved early sites anywhere in the world. There are wooden frames of shelters, with the timbers still lying where they fell. There is knotted cordage, made of local reeds, still tied. There are chewed wads of medicinal plants. There are hearths. There is a human footprint pressed in a clay beside one of them. And there is seaweed, 9 different species, brought from a coast about 90 kilometers away. The dates came back at around 14,500 years ago. That is more than 1,000 years before Clovis. And Monte Verde is not near Beringia. It is about 16,000 kilometers away, at the far end of both continents. If people were living in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they did not arrive through a corridor that opened at 13,000. The site was attacked for 20 years. And then, in 1997, something happened that almost never happens in this field. A group of the most prominent skeptics agreed to fly to Chile and look at the site themselves, together with Dillahey present. And they accepted it, in public, in print. That is the moment the paradigm broke, and notice what broke it. Not a new technique, not a better date. People physically going and looking at something that spent 2 decades explaining away. And then, having lost its first site, the model lost its doorway too. Because the ice-free corridor turns out not to work. The corridor is the gap between the Laurentide ice sheet in the east and the Cordilleran in the west. And yes, it did eventually open. But a gap between 2 walls of ice is not a road. It is a long, cold, sterile trench full of meltwater lakes and bare gravel. Before anybody can walk 1,500 kilometers down it, something has to be living in it. In 2016, a team led by Mikkel Peterson took sediment cores from lakes along the corridor route and read the ancient DNA in the mud. They were looking for the point at which the corridor becomes biologically usable. Plants first, then grazing animals, then predators. And that point turns out to be about 12,600 years ago, which is after Clovis. So the corridor cannot have been the route for the first people, because it was not habitable until after the first people were already there. It may well have been used later. It may have been used in the other direction, going north. But as the front door to the Americas, it is closed. So if not through the middle, then how? The answer most researchers now favor is the coast. In 2007, John Erlandson and colleagues laid out what has become known as the kelp highway hypothesis. Kelp forests grow in cold, shallow, rocky water, and they are extraordinarily productive. They support fish, shellfish, sea otters, seals, and birds, and they are stable and predictable in a way that land is not. And crucially, an almost continuous belt of them runs from northern Japan, around the rim of the North Pacific, past Alaska, and all the way down to California and beyond. For people with boats, that is not a barrier. It is a route with a supermarket attached, running past the end of the ice. It also matches something we have seen elsewhere in this series. In the episode on crossing the sea, we watch people reach Australia at least 65,000 years ago over open water. Boats were not new. They were extremely old. So the coastal route is plausible, well supported by ecology and consistent with the genetics. And there's a very large problem with it. The coastline those people would have walked and paddled along is now underwater. Sea level at the height of the last ice age was around 120 meters lower than today. So the beaches, the river mouths, the campsites, and the shell middens are all sitting offshore, on a drowned continental shelf, most of it battered by the rising sea that covered it. Which means the primary evidence for how people entered the Americas is, by definition, in a place we cannot excavate. There are hints in the places where the old coast is still reachable. There are early sites on the Channel Islands off California, and on islands off British Columbia and Baja. And at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, on a river that runs to the Pacific, Loren Davis and colleagues have dated occupation to around 16,000 years, with stem stone points that look more like Japanese forms than like anything in the Clovis tradition. But the main body of the evidence is drowned, and the argument of the last 90 years has been conducted entirely in the leftovers. And then, in 2021, it got considerably stranger. At White Sands in New Mexico, in the bed of a lake that dried up long ago, there are footprints. Not one or two, thousands in layers of adults and children walking across wet ground. A team led by Matthew Bennett dated seeds in the sediment layers above and below the prints. The answer came back between about 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. That is not a little earlier than Clovis. That is 10,000 years earlier. And worse, it is right in the middle of the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets were at their largest, and any route through the middle of the continent was sealed shut. The objection came quickly, and it was a good one. The seeds are from an aquatic plant, and aquatic plants can take up carbon dissolved from ancient rock in the groundwater, which would make them test older than they are, and would make the dates worthless. So in 2023, the team came back with two completely independent methods. They radiocarbon dated conifer pollen from the same layers, which comes from air and not from the water. And they used optical dating on quartz grains, which measures how long a grain has been buried in the dark. Both agreed with the original result. The argument is not over, but White Sands is no longer a fringe claim, and it is very hard to dismiss. There are other very early candidates too, and they are more contested. Meanwhile, the genetics has been telling its own version, and it does not agree with the footprints. Ancient DNA says the founding population of the Americas comes from a mixture of an East Asian source and a North Eurasian one. And it says that population was isolated for thousands of years somewhere before it spread. That period is usually called the Beringian standstill. In 2018, a genome from an infant buried at Upward Sun River in Alaska revealed a whole branch nobody knew about. That lineage split from other Native American ancestors around 20,000 years ago and stayed in the north. They are called ancient Beringians. And the split between the northern and southern branches of Native American ancestry looks like about 16,000 years ago, after which the southern branch spreads to the far end of South America extraordinarily fast. So the DNA points to a spread starting around 16,000 years ago. And the footprints say there were people in New Mexico at 23,000. Those two things have not been reconciled. Either there was an earlier group that left footprints and left no detectable genetic trace in later populations, or one of the two lines of evidence is wrong. Anybody who tells you this is settled is not being straight with you. Which brings me to the thing I actually want to leave you with. Look at why Clovis fooled everybody for 60 years. It was not stupidity. Clovis is genuinely conspicuous. The points are distinctive, they are beautiful, they are everywhere, and they cluster in a narrow band of time. But now think about where they are. Clovis sites are inland. They are on the plains at kill sites, in river valleys, in exactly the places North American archaeology has been excavating hardest for a century. And the coastal route, if it happened, left its record on land that has been underwater for 10,000 years. So Clovis was never the arrival. Clovis is the moment people moved far enough inland and became visible enough to leave a record in the places we happen to be able to look. We mistook the first thing we could see for the first thing that happened. And that is not a mistake about America. The record is not a sample of the past. It is a sample of what survived in places we thought to dig. So I will end with the footprints because of what one particular set of them shows. At White Sands, there is a trackway running for about 1.5 kilometers. It was made by a young person walking quickly, carrying a small child on one hip. Every so often the prints change because the child was set down for a moment and there are small feet beside the large ones. Then the child is picked up again and the walk continues. On the way back, a few hours later, the small prints are gone. Only the adult return along that line. And crossing the trackway, at one point, are the tracks of a mammoth. Whatever the date turns out to be, that is not an artifact, and it is not a theory. It is somebody carrying a child across wet ground in a hurry a very long time ago.